Several years ago, a gentleman from Alberta dropped by the church. He was a retired lawyer and a judge. He was in his mid-90s. He was born in Oakville, but he had come back to Oakville to see the places that he used to know. He had spent his whole adult life in Alberta. And our church was at the top of his list. So we came here into the sanctuary, and he just stopped, and tears filled his eyes. He said, "Oh, it's not like it was. It's not like it was at all. The balcony came up, well, up over there, and there weren't these stained glass windows the same, well, there were so many changes. The pews had been relocated." And it was true. Indeed, in our ever-changing world, this church has changed many times. It was built in 1877, and it's been updated and modified to meet the needs of the people, the children, the generations, its mission to the world and to Oakville. I suspect that one of the first changes that took place was the installation of electricity, because in 1877, Edison had got nowhere near yet inventing the electric light or devising all the things to generate power and deliver it to houses and homes and churches. Now, churches are made of stones and bricks and iron and cement and slate and all that sort of jazz. And it's the same as any other building that way. But there's a difference. Churches are different. And it's not just because of the rich architectural traditions that churches have, vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows, and towers that loom up. It's more than that. Churches are purpose-built buildings. They're built to be a place where you worship, where you grow in faith, and where you get equipped to do the work of God. Being faithful is always, of course, a work in progress. It's always a journey of discovery. It's finding new depths of meaning. It's building stronger relationships with God and with each other, and finding new ways to serve. Thus, a church is always changing, as the world is always changing. We have to seek new ways to serve our community, generation after generation. So this church has gone through a whole series of adjustments and changes, renovations, because this is a place where faith is. And faith is always changing. By faith we live in the present. By faith we honor the past, and by faith we reach to the future.
A history of St. John's United Church, Oakville. St. John's United Church owes its existence to one of the most community-minded of the early inhabitants of Oakville, Mr. Justice Wright Williams. In the 1830s, Oakville was part of the Nelson Wesleyan Methodist circuit. A minister would travel around on horseback to a circuit of communities, including Nelson, Palermo, Munns, Oakville, and north to Stewarttown, to preach and perform the sacraments. A community was fortunate to see a minister once a month or 6 weeks. Mr. Williams thought that wasn't good enough, and became the driving force behind the creation of a Methodist congregation in Oakville. By 1840, sufficient funds had been raised to build a chapel on Colburn Street. Dedicated in October of 1840, the 110-foot-high spire would dominate downtown Oakville for the next 50 years. Sadly, the congregation found that they lacked the money to maintain the building, and so they sold it to the Anglicans in 1841. The Anglicans would stay there until 1884, when they moved to the new St. Jude's Church. The chapel building, less the spire, would then be used for commercial purposes until bought by the Merchants Bank in 1898. In 1910, it was replaced with a new bank building. The street walls of the bank building are now the facade of the anthropology store. After migrating between the Oakville Common School and the Temperance Hall, the Methodist congregation purchased a piece of property at Dunn and Randall Streets and put up a frame structure which was officially opened in 1852. Growing numbers in the congregation required the installation of a balcony in 1857, and by the early 1870s it was clear that a bigger structure would be needed. More property was acquired, and in 1877 the Oakville Wesleyan Methodist Church was built on the present site of St. John's. The old chapel building was sold and moved to Colburn and Thomas Streets for use as a commercial building. Cobb's Bread and the old-fashioned butchery now occupy the building. When the new church was dedicated on January 13, 1878, the congregation pledged over $14,000, which was enough to pay the remainder of the cost of the church, the organ, the sheds, and a fence. It's interesting to note that a fence was required at the time because cattle and pigs often wandered through the town. 1915 was a busy year of renovations and the addition of the most treasured artifacts in the church, namely 4 of the beautiful stained glass windows. 2 were donated by a member of 2 separate families, Mr. W.S. Savage and Mr. Arthur Forster, in memory of family members. 2 were purchased by groups, the Epworth League, a Methodist youth group, and the women of the church headed up by Mrs. Mary Irvin. There's an interesting story behind this window known as the Early Mother's Window. It seems that the Reverend Smith spoke about the good work done by the early fathers of the church who had labored so long and hard to establish it. He suggested that a stained glass window should be installed in their memory. This prompted Mrs. Irvin to ask, "What about the early mothers?" She didn't stop at asking. She got busy and began to collect money to purchase another window, and before long she had enough not only for the window but for a brass plaque on which the names of 29 women are engraved. And guess what? There never was a window dedicated to the early fathers. The church lost 17 members of the congregation during the First World War. They were remembered with a dedicated stained glass window in 1920. It depicts a solitary soldier with no visible rank insignia. Therefore, he represents all ranks. The Canadian red ensign is draped over his shoulder, and he holds a bugle, symbolizing a call to battle. Above and behind the soldier stands Jesus, his right hand pointing the way, his left hand in a traditional blessing. This window reflects a time of great patriotism, and the people wanted to honor the commitment of the men who fought for their country. In 1923, a new church hall was constructed to provide space for the growing number of children in Sunday school and other activities. It was named Lusk Hall after the late Dr. Charles Lusk. He had been involved with the church since the 1870s. He was a Sunday school superintendent for 31 years and on the board of trustees from 1873 until 1914. In 1925, the Methodist Church merged with the Congregational Church and some Presbyterian churches to form the United Church of Canada. The new name, St. John's, reflects both the Apostle John and the founders of the 3 merging churches, John Wesley, John Robinson, and John Knox. In 1938, despite the cost of constructing Lusk Hall and the effects of the Depression, A reorganization of the interior of the sanctuary brought it to its present layout. Soon after, the Second World War began, and once again, St. John's men were heading overseas to fight the worst enemy the world had ever seen. 12 members of the congregation were lost in that battle. Their names were added to the First World War memorial beside the soldier's window. In 1952, new additions were made to the church structure. A chancel providing seating for the choir, organist, and minister was added at the east end of the sanctuary, replacing the old gymnasium. A narthex, or a vestibule, was added at the main entrance. It was at this time that the new Cassavant organ was installed and still remains to this day one of the few pipe organs in the area. The prosperity of the 1950s saw the congregation grow to more than the capacity of the church. 2 new churches, St. Paul's United and Maple Grove United, were established in 1955 from the congregation at St. John's. 5 more beautiful stained glass windows were installed between 1966 and 1983, until every window in the sanctuary was beautified. Amazingly, after the major renovation in 2009, 2 more small stained glass windows, which were removed from St. Clement's Anglican Church in Toronto, were offered by the Robert McCausland Company at a bargain price. These were installed in the interior walls in Terry Chapel in 2010. In 1994, the Oakville Ministerial Association Window Committee had a beautiful stained glass window created in duplicate for the chapel in the Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital. When the new hospital was built in 2015, one of those windows was moved to a wall in the hospital near the elevators. In 2017, the duplicate window was offered to St. John's. It is now located above the Randall Street entrance. A booklet entitled "The Cross and the Windows of St. John's United Church" has been created about all of these treasured windows, giving a concise history of each. In 1967, a major renovation to Lusk Hall provided more Sunday school rooms, a refurbished kitchen, and a new church office. 1969 saw a spirited debate over the destruction of the manse, which was built in 1869 next door to the church. Much as many of the congregation wanted to save it, dry rot and other structural problems meant that the 100-year-old house had to come down. The lot became a municipal parking lot and remained so until 2008, when it was sold to a developer and the Coventry condominium was built. In 1986, the congregation approved the installation of a memorial garden and a bell tower to be placed between the original church and Lusk Hall. The garden has become a quiet meeting place for those with loved ones whose ashes are buried in the garden, and also for anyone passing by. The most major renovation of all took place in 2009, when Lusk Hall was refurbished, reconfigured, and renovated from top to bottom. The kitchen became the lobby, the nursery became the kitchen, the boardroom became the choir room, the office became a washroom, and the choir room became the minister's office. The narrow, winding hallway from the sanctuary to Lusk Hall disappeared and opened up space for meeting, welcoming, and visiting. Ongoing improvements have taken place ever since, thanks to a stellar group of multi-skilled volunteers on the property committee. Our building is the home of an enduring community of faith in the heart of Oakville, a place where people support one another in times of war and peace, of prosperity and pandemics, a place of prayer and laughter, of growing up and growing old, where generation after generation charity and service flourish. A community like our building, ever changing to meet the future and build on the past. What would Justice Wright Williams think if he were to come back almost 190 years later and see what that small early group in the 1830s has grown to become today? Perhaps a good moniker would be Ever Faithful.
I have always been pretty traditional when it comes to church life. On Sunday mornings, I've always been most comfortable in the black Geneva gown that my father wore during his ministry. I've almost exclusively served churches with a strong sense of their history. I love Gothic architecture and old stained glass windows. And so I am so pleased that we have applied for heritage designation for St. John's so that important things from our past will be preserved for the future. But the experience of COVID has also helped me to refocus a bit. Before my time at St. John's, our beautiful old solid wooden front doors were replaced by contemporary glass doors. And there was, and still is, some unhappiness with that decision, and I completely understand that. But the one important lesson I think we've all learned as a church community during COVID is that we simply cannot sit back and wait for people to come in to sit in our pews. We need to be out there in the world, in the community in which we live. The fact that we can see out through the new glass doors and that others can see in is an important symbol for us as we look to the future. We simply cannot set ourselves apart from the world around us and assume that what we do here once a week is the most important thing about our life together. There is a saying that the most important thing we can give our children is roots and wings. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember as a church as well. We need to know, respect, and preserve our heritage, our roots, but we also need to fly. I think we've achieved that balance at St. John's.